and a parent, I just couldn't sit on the sidelines and allow these kids to organize and to fight for their rights and actually fight for their lives without doing anything. We're the adults in the room. We are supposed to be doing that. We're supposed to be protecting our youth. And so we should be coming up with the ideas and how to protect our kids, not them. So with that being said, I approached Maria and broached the question about doing this panel, and she totally agreed. And so we have you guys here. And why Columbia County? Well, Columbia County, if many don't know, is now the home of the new NRA president. And that doesn't surprise me at all. In Columbia County, we have a vibrant sportsman community. I'm part of that community. We like to hunt, we like to fish. I think we have gun owners in this community that are very conscious about gun safety. They love their community, and they certainly want to make sure their children are protected. And I believe that if we can get our sportsmen saying the same message as those kids who have been protesting across the country to protect themselves, that we can convince our legislators in Washington that something needs to be done. I know we have a lot of sportsmen in Columbia County who think the same way that I do. I talk to them on a daily basis. I firmly believe that it is on our shoulders as parents, as sportsmen, as citizens to protect our youth. And we should be moving forward and doing that. So a call to action, we have a petition out in the hallway, and that petition, if you agree with the language that is on there, and I tried to make it as ambiguous as possible, please do sign that petition, and so we can send that off to our federal elected officials to show them that if we could do it here in Columbia County, you could do it there where you live. And let's get some sensible laws passed and protect our kids. Thank you. Technology. So I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. I am proud to say he's a professor of psychology and evolutionary studies at SUNY Loopholes, a founder member of Move Forward New York. He writes for Psychology Today, including many articles related to gun violence. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome, let me introduce to you Glenn Garrett.
All right. Thank you so much, Billy, for all your work in organizing this. Thanks to all the volunteers. Thank you to our friend Johnny, who's been running around organizing things. And thank you, of course, to all of our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules. So I've got some introductory words, and then we're going to go to the panelists, and I'll describe the format in just a little bit. So like many of us, I am deeply concerned about the issue of gun violence in our country. Parkland was a wake-up call, but so was Orlando, and so was Las Vegas, and so was Fort Lauderdale, and so was Santa Fe, Texas, and so was Columbine, and so on. This country has a problem with gun violence that is unique in the developed world. More than 30,000 people a year die from gun violence in the United States of America. To put that figure in perspective, note that there are about 6,000 residents of Hudson. So we're talking 5 times the entire population of this city each year. Think about that. In a recent trip to China, I met up with a professor there and had a very interesting conversation. So another friend of mine from New Paltz asked this woman, Jenny, who's a professor in China, he said, this thing in Texas, do you ever have anything like that in China? And she gave the quickest and most straightforward answer, which was no, because guns are illegal in China. That was all she said. I thought that was pretty provocative. As a behavioral scientist, I'm a big believer in what we call multifactorial causation. Most behaviors and actions have multiple causes, and we need to truly embrace this concept as we move forward to address America's gun violence problem. It is up to us as active members of our community to draw on the best scientific data that exists on this topic and to enact legislation that follows from science. We are not going to solve our nation's gun problem without relying on the science. Of this we can be assured. Across the nation, kids regularly experience lockdown drills, and they don't like it, and they don't deserve it. Our kids don't belong under their desks. They don't belong in closets. Our kids don't deserve to be scared to go to school. This is not the America that we know and love. It is up to all of us right now to take control of this situation. This is not about opinions, and we need to all realize this fact. This is not a political issue. This is a human issue. Everyone in this nation is dealing with the same problem right now. And wherever you are politically, we all have the same shared interest in fixing this problem. We are all in this together. So with this said, thank you so much to our panelists who've taken the time out of their busy schedules to be here. Thank you all for coming out today. When community leaders get together and engage with the public, we all win. So thank you all for coming out today. A couple quick comments regarding the structure. We have 8 panelists. Each panelist is going to speak for 4 minutes, and Megan and Andrew in the front are going to be very fierce keeping people on time. So if the panelists could just take a look, they have signs for 30 seconds, 1 minute, 30 seconds, and then a stop sign in red, just to try to keep things in order. After the panelists speak, there's going to be 2 sets of questions. There are questions that were submitted ahead of time that I will be reading to people. And there are questions that are people are going to ask actually on the spot. So we'll have about an hour worth of that, and then we'll wrap things up. So that is the process. And with that said, let me introduce our first speaker. The reason we are here today is for the kids, and this kid is the star of the Hudson High School, Sadiq Ahmed. Sadiq won the Blue Hawk Award for soccer. He won the Multicultural Award from the University at Albany. He is going to start a program in business administration in Ithaca, and he is going to talk to you about his perspective on gun violence in America. Sadiq.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sadiq Ahmed. I want to thank everyone for coming here today. I want to personally thank those sitting beside me for making the time. There have been many arguments in the past for and against gun violence and gun control and gun laws. But one thing that both sides have to agree on is that guns are used to kill. I just want to make it clear that I'm not here to argue. I want to get a better understanding of what you think about gun control, school safety, and mental health. We go to school to get an education, to learn new skills, and to pave a way for our future. None of us plan on getting shot or saying our last goodbyes to our parents before going to school.
Louder.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Very often, we hear the term mentally ill used to describe the shooters. This discussion should not just be talked about in school, but in homes as well. The shooter may have mental illness, but we cannot deny the fact that their actions classify them as terrorists. Oh, that word, terrorists. We start hearing that word more frequently after 9/11. It only took one tragic day, and airport security spiked. There were extra screenings and more precautions. How is it that over 20 school shootings in 2018 alone, and there is still no action? We had a national walkout a couple months ago in solidarity for the victims of the Parkland shooting. A couple students and I spoke at that event. Here I am again, speaking with a similar message. When will we say enough is enough and actually move forward to change gun laws, make our schools safer, and put more funds into helping treating the mentally ill? How many more school shootings will it take for us to realize that just talking about this issue isn't enough? More lives will be in danger tomorrow if we do not act today. We cannot go back and change the past, but we can write a better future, a safer future. Let's write it together. Thank you.
Our next speaker on my list in this particular order is certified safety professional Mike Needham, who's an expert on gun safety with extensive training in that area. Mr. Needham.
Thank you. And what I'm really going to speak to today is school and community safety, probably a little bit more than gun violence specifically. When we look at community violence, it goes way back in community violence against schools. Actually, we always think about things like Columbine as being obviously a tragic event, but it's not the first by any means. Probably the greatest act of school violence that we ever saw was in Bath, Wisconsin, over a century ago. A board member who was frustrated with his peers took 500 pounds of a material called pyritol from his farm as a blasting agent, blew up the school building, and killed pretty much every kid in the town. So this is not a new idea for us, but I think the problem that we're seeing now, and I think Sheriff Bartlett will probably tend to this as well, is this idea of active shooters. And I think if we're going to fix this problem, we really need to look at the root cause of it. It's not the lack of hardness of school doors, the lack of SROs or trained teachers and things like that. When you go through the list of factors of active shooters, and we call them factors, not profiles, but they're young males typically, 18 to 40. They don't deal with failure or lack of success very well. They lack social bonds. And those are two that I'm very, very interested in. If you think about that lack of social bonds, I grew up in a rural school district in North Carolina, and our church was the center of our town. Everything happened through the church, and FFA and Boy Scouting organizations like that. There was a lot of bonds with the community, and I think we're losing those in many respects. I heard one of my employees cite a study in a recent presentation on threat assessment or risk intervention for schools. He was saying he saw a survey from 1975 where they asked Americans, if something really bad happened to you in your life, how many people would have your back, would be there to help you? And he said that the answer was typically 4 to 5 people. And he said, when you ask that question now, it's often 0 to 1. And we've isolated ourselves in some ways. And so I think in the short term, people like me spend a lot of time hardening schools, camera technology, emergency response procedures, training and drilling and things like that. But the long-term fix for this particular problem is the strengthening of our communities and ultimately looking at ourselves a little bit in the mirror as parents too, and our role and how we're involved in our children's lives. And I think that longer term, that will ultimately have the greatest impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Next, we've got the Director of Mental Health for Columbia County, Michael Cole. He is a licensed clinical social worker, administrator in the public sector for more than 2 decades, and he oversees a broad array of programs related to mental health issues. Michael Cole.
Good evening. I'm not sure I've ever spoken for 4 minutes, but I'm going to try. I'm going to talk about what I know, which is mental health and substance use. My title is Director of Community Services for Columbia County. I work for the Community Services Board in our county and the Board of Supervisors, and I oversee the care of individuals impacted by mental illness, substance use disorder, and intellectual disabilities. I'll just give you a brief overview of what we have in terms of mental health and substance abuse services in our schools in Columbia County. 5 of the 6 districts have licensed OMH, Office of Mental Health clinic satellites. 3 districts have New York State Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Service prevention services. The Department of Human Service and the Mobile Crisis Assessment Team have crisis support available for all districts. DARE, Catholic Charities, the Mentor Foundation, and school resource officers offer support across districts. The Department of Health has health home care coordinators serving children in all of our districts. There are a variety of after-schools, esteem building and pro-social activities which support our kids. There are many gaps and challenges to setting up on-site services in schools. We must remember that mental health services and substance abuse services are voluntary. An individual engages in treatment not because they need it, but because they want it. To a large extent, there are some rare exceptions to that. It is my opinion that there is no single cause for why we're here tonight, although it's very tempting for us to simplify this and you know, my opinion is that we have to look at multiple simultaneous solutions. A challenge that school districts have is that there is pressure, core curriculum and seat time pressures on faculty, and stigma restrict time available for on-site services. Districts often need services which are unreimbursable by clinic staff. Federal guidelines for prevention services restrict the type of services that are funded. Parental involvement in mental health and substance abuse treatment is essential, but yet very challenging because our parents, our families are very distressed and overwhelmed. Risk assessment and management is not a science. It's a blend of science and art. It's evolving science. We have opportunities. Districts could fund non-reimbursable services needed. Recent mental health education requirements will assist, I think, in increasing education and awareness of mental health and substance abuse issues. Just to speak briefly about the correlation between violence and mental illness. In stark contrast to media characterization, individuals impacted by the disease of mental illness are far more likely, 11 times more likely to be the victims of violent crimes than they are perpetrators. Risk factors include adverse childhood experiences, exposure to physical, emotional, or sexual abuse or neglect, bullying, social isolation, food and housing insecurity. Protective factors include early intervention, opportunities to connect, opportunities to talk, pro-social opportunities. I could go on, but I'm getting a stop sign. Talk saves lives. Treatment works, recovery is possible, and all around us.
Great, thank you so much. So next on my list, I've got Columbia County Sheriff David Bartlett. He's been sheriff since 2013. He's got an extraordinary resume, including having won an award from the Insurance Women of the Hudson Valley for his part in disarming an armed suicidal individual, and a separate award from the New York State Sheriff's Association for pulling an individual from a burning vehicle. So I'm deeply impressed by this. Please join me in welcoming Sheriff Bartlett.
Thank you, Matt. I'm just going to talk about what we've been doing here at the Sheriff's Office since I become sheriff, as far as active shooter situations and what we've been doing in the schools. Initially, when I came in, the only school that had a school resource officer was the school we're sitting in now. All the other schools, the governor had pulled out the state police, and they were empty. Right away, I went right in, and Ichabod Crane and Takana Kills went full-time with school resource deputies. Chatham and New Lebanon share one. Germantown and Hudson share one. I'm happy to say I'm working with the Board of Supervisors right now and Chairman Morrell, and it looks very good that we're going to have full-time deputies now in all of the schools in the county. Germantown, Chatham, and New Lebanon are all going on board. So I'm basically just working with them on funding. The school resource deputy program is more than just having a cop in the school. They're a resource for the school. They're working with the schools. They sit on panels, and they're a friend of the kids. They sit down, and the kids actually trust them, and it's such a great partnership. Working with Mike working with the other police agencies, the state police, the City of Hudson Police Department. We've got a great community, and I think Mike hit the nail right on the head. The community has to come together and has to work on this problem. Another thing that we've been doing, and we've been training, I can't even say hundreds of people, it's been thousands of people, in the Civilian Response to Active Shooter Event Program, or the CRACE program. And the CRACE program is basically a program that's going to give you situational awareness if you are in an active shooter event, or in some other type of an event where you need to help yourself and save yourself. One of the situations that are detailed in that case is the Warwick, Rhode Island fire many years ago, not that many years ago, where many people were killed in that fire. And people get their mindset of, if I asked everybody in the room right now, where's the exit here? Probably the majority of the people are going to say those two. Well, there's exits here, there's exits behind us. In the event of a fire, in the event of a situation in here. So the CRACE course is that we've had nothing but positive response back from that. And if you ever get a chance to take it, please take it. If you want it at your organization or at your work, please get a hold of me. And I'd be more than glad to send our people down to teach it. Deputies on the streets have been outfitted with the proper gear and equipment to deal with any type of situation in the schools. We train all together. All the agencies train, so it's not the state police are doing one thing, the sheriff's doing one thing, the city police are doing one thing. We train as a unit. We train as a community. So I want to thank everybody for coming here tonight. If you have any questions once we're done, because this is going to be a quick forum, please grab a hold of me or you can call me at my office. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Next, we've got our Congressman representing us from Kinderhook, John Faso. John has served as the minority leader of the New York State Assembly for several years, and he's been in public service since 1986, representing the people in New York. Relevant to today's topic, he is also a co-sponsor of House Bill 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, which I know a few people have asked me to ask him about to speak to, if that's feasible. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Faso.
Well, Ben, thank you very much, and thank you all of the folks in the audience for coming out tonight. This is a really important topic. Thank you, Maria, for opening the Hudson City Schools to us, and thank you, Billy Hughes, for organizing this. It's truly important. Let me address a number of issues, because the incidents that have occurred, whether it was Parkland recently, or Santa Fe, or Las Vegas, back to Columbine, and incidents that were mentioned well over 100 years ago. These should all shock our conscience, and they should all spur us to try to address what are the causes of this and what can we do collectively as communities, as government, as individuals, and as nonprofits and others to try to address this situation. So there have been a number of issues that have been raised, and a lot of those issues get raised here in questions tonight. Let me say a couple of things. In terms of response that Congress has taken to the Las Vegas shooting, for instance, that individual used a device called a bump stock, which frankly, most even gun enthusiasts never heard of this before. I had certainly never heard of it. That has effectively been outlawed now by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. In response to that incident, where someone was able to convert a semi-automatic to a fully automatic weapon. Automatic weapons have been illegal in this country, or highly regulated in this country, since the 1930s. And oftentimes, devices like the bump stock come to the scene, which frankly turn a weapon which is legal into one that is illegal. That has now been banned. But the second thing that I think is important is that there were loopholes in the background check system, and we saw this vividly in connection with the Texas church shooting last year, where a dishonorably discharged Air Force veteran who was dishonorably discharged for domestic violence. His dishonorable discharge was never reported to the background check system. That has now been changed in law, enacted into law, signed by the president, so that the government agencies, particularly the military in this situation, must refer such individuals to the background check. We have also greatly enhanced funding that flows through the states to the various community and local organizations for mental health funding. This is an enormous gap that we have in our services. And it's very true that mental health is not necessarily correlated to these shooters, who are overwhelmingly aged 15 to 25 or 30, who are male, who are young men and boys who have, whether they've been bullied in school, whether they've been isolated, whether they feel a social estrangement from their families and their community. That is, I think, probably the focus that we need to pay most attention to, which is why are these young people, these boys and young men, so taken to and so alienated that they would commit these type crimes. Lastly, Congress is also, besides enacting legislation on a bipartisan basis that I voted for in the budget last March, greatly increasing mental health funding, we have also increased funding for school security. It is nowhere near enough. It was about $75 million, but it was a start. And this will assist schools to harden their facilities, to make themselves more safety conscious, etc. Lastly, I want to say that we're also working on legislation that would be a red flag law, protecting due process rights for individuals. But if a school or family member feels that an individual is a threat to themselves or their communities, a red flag law modeled after something already in place in Indiana for the last 10 years, and it's worked successfully, would allow, with due process rights, would allow a judge to remove firearms from an individual who is deemed a threat to themselves or their community. So there are many other pieces of legislation we can discuss, and I'm glad to be here tonight to have the opportunity to answer your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Faso. Next, we've got someone who I think has played a big role in helping today happen. The superintendent for our district that we're in here in Hudson, Dr. Maria Suttmeier, a recent winner of the Sons and Daughters of Italy Positive Image Award for positive work in the community. Thank you for hosting us, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Maria Suttmeier.
Thank you. First, I just want to personally thank everyone for coming out this evening and welcome you to our school district. When Bill Hughes came to me and said, are you interested in hosting a conversation about school safety and gun issues and mental health issues, of course, how could I say no? It hits home for us. I feel highly responsible, not only for the academic outcomes of our students here in school, but you can't have academic progress in our school without being safe. Our students need to be able to come to school and have fun, feel safe, and learn without worrying about what might happen with violence in schools. When I started my career here in Hudson 19 years ago, it was the week of Columbine. So it is unbelievable that we are still talking about school violence and students being killed in school settings almost 20 years later. So it's time that we put our heads together, talk with our experts, come together as a community, and figure out what the solutions are. We know that students need assistance. We know that they need an education that is free from violence. How do we do that? As a school district, you know, every time something hits the news, you tighten up. You think of one more thing that you might be able to do to keep your school secure, keep your children safe. I have just under 1,800 students congregating Monday through Friday. They're walking through our doors at 8 o'clock in the morning. That's a heavy responsibility and a burden when you feel that you need to do everything you can to protect them so that they come to school for all of the right reasons. So that's why we're here tonight, is how can we work together to ensure that that is what's happening in our schools across the country. We're doing what we can to provide safety protocols. I'm working collaboratively with our community-based organizations, our law enforcement. We have Mike Needham that works closely with our school district every year to provide us with expert experience and advice of how we can do things better in our schools. But yet, when I'm listening to the news and yet another event is happening, you wonder, are you doing enough? And it has to happen outside of our schools. The schools cannot do this alone. We need to come together as a country, and we need to start changing how we're doing things. So I'm delighted to have everyone here tonight. I think having conversations like this are going to be the difference and the game changer for us. So thank you for being here tonight, and let's hope we come away with a goal of improving our safety in our schools.
Thank you, Dr. Suttmeier. And next, we've got another representative. We've got Assemblymember Didi Barrett, who represents folks here in the 106th Legislative District of New York. She's been doing this since 2012. She has worked extensively on issues related to women's issues, agriculture, mental health, among many others. Please join me in welcoming Assemblymember Didi Barrett.
Thank you, and I want to also thank Bill Hughes and Maria for organizing this. I can't think of a better place for a conversation like this than in our schools and in our school here in Columbia County, because whether you're a gun owner and a second right advocate or whether you're a gun control advocate, you care about your children, you care about our community, and this is where we should be having these conversations. So thank all of you for being here and being part of this conversation, as well as my colleagues on the panel here. So my first instinct when it comes to gun violence is always as a mother. Following each of these instincts, I imagine what it would be like to be the mother of a victim. I also imagine what it would be like to be the mother of the shooter. As a mother, in the end, I will do whatever I can to prevent another parent from burying a child from gun violence. And that means whether the shooting happens in school, on a campus, whether it happens on their way to and from school, and these are not just young men who are shooting kids in those situations. It matters whether it's in their neighborhoods, it matters when it's in their home. And it's the vote that I took when I supported the SAFE Act. It was an imperfect legislation the way it came about, but again, my commitment is to do anything that I can to keep another parent from having to bury a child, and that keeps them happening way too often in our country right now. Let me also say that it isn't my goal to restrict access to responsible, law-abiding gun owners either. I support the Second Amendment, and I recognize the importance that sports and shooting sports and hunting are to our region and are to many families in our region, and I support the right for those families to have those, to be law-abiding and to practice safe gun practices in their communities. However, every year the CDC and the FBI report that more than 30,000 American lives are cut short from gun violence, and more than half of those are suicides, which is a really important piece of this gun violence issue. Every day, 19 children are shot in America, according to a recent study, and nearly 1,300 kids under the age of 18 die every year from gunshot wounds, and that's according to the CDC. I've spoken to parents, teachers, school administrators across my district that talk about mental health being the #1 issue in their classrooms. This includes elementary school. So the stress that our kids are operating under every single day is really untenable. And that includes having to do drills that make them go into a closet at this point when they're doing safe shooter training drills. And it's kind of impossible to imagine sending your child to school to have them do that kind of drill at the age of 5 or 6 or 7 or even older. Recently, I went to Taconic Hills when they had the National Walkout Day, and we talked, as we have, as I said earlier, about how this is really a place where our schools can be having this conversation. I know that there continues to be a disconnect between what Americans want. 97% of people surveyed in a national Quinnipiac poll support background checks. We've seen that over and over again, yet almost a quarter of gun purchases are obtained without any kind of background check. So this disconnect is something that we have to work on. We have to have the conversations, have the dialogues that make us move forward on the kind of legislation and the kind of policies that will change this trajectory in our country. I thank you all for being part of that.
Thank you, Didi. And last but not least, we have got the police chief of the great city of Hudson, Edward Moore. He has served as a New York State Trooper for 32 years, and he has served as the chief of police here since 2013. Please join me in welcoming Chief Moore.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be on this panel tonight. Before I say a few words, this time of year, I'm always a little nostalgic. I think about 40 years ago, getting ready for my prom, like the kids here at Hudson are tonight, tomorrow, and worrying about getting a few dollars from my car for gasoline or worrying about my tuxedo. But it's stunning in contrast to what these kids have to worry about today. It's rather sad. I never once, back in the 70s, had to concern myself with even thinking about being a victim of the gun violence in my school. So it's kind of sad and something we need to get in the right direction. You know, my duties here as your police chief is that in all likelihood, one of my officers will be the first person on the scene. I've been at a scene of a active shooter that there was no training involved. There was no preparation, and it was an unorganized mess that was very dangerous. My mission is to make sure that that does not happen here. I'm very comfortable with the relationship we have with the sheriff's office, state police, school district. My sole job is to be prepared, train, prepare, and to practice, to put every asset we can to protect the children of the school district. And I pledge to you that is what we will do. We've made great progress, very comfortable with the relationship we have with law enforcement. But I see that as my duty to make sure that we're here. I see at Parkland, I saw at Columbine, the mistakes that were made. People weren't prepared. The officers did not do the right thing. I have to make sure the responsibility is on my shoulders, that that doesn't happen here. And that is what I pledge to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Moore. The next section of the agenda is essentially going to be me reading for the panelists questions that have been submitted ahead of time. And while I do have some names of some specific panelists here, if anyone wants to jump in or has thoughts, please, by all means, we would welcome that. So here's a question from Elmer Lesueur, and it is this: is there any local, state, federal, or other grants or funding resources available to do a safety assessment so that we can figure out which schools are at higher risk, what programs, funds, or resources are available to make any needed improvements that don't require putting guns in teachers' hands? And the first person listed here, so maybe I'll list the two people and then others who want to jump in. The first person listed here is Didi. So Didi, if you could respond to that.
I mean, I think that it would be better to hear from Mike Needham about this, because if you're actually looking at these policies, there is potentially state funding, but this is not the kind of policies that New York State would necessarily put forward. So,
Sure.
There's a number of pieces of legislation and regulations, specifically the commissioner's regulations related to school safety that kind of fall into play here. One of them that's important and we haven't really spoken about here is Dignity for All Students Act, which is another of the factors when we think about violence. We have to do training each year, and there's a process where if a student's bullied or harassed, we can report that, and that's kind of important. And then we also have the Schools Against Violence in Education rules. We have building level emergency response plans, and we do training and we do assessments of the facilities. And it's sort of a complicated question because we look at the plant facilities of the school. We look at door hardening. We look at Hudson has a fairly special door technology. They're called intruder locks that many schools don't have. These types of things. So we think about physical security within the school building. And then we also think about the other components, the risk assessments in terms of the population. And that's something that actually Hudson's doing a lot of work on, because generally if somebody's going to hurt other people, they usually give you clues. That law enforcement refers to it as leakage. They tell you voluntarily or involuntarily, through their Facebook posts and the poetry they write and the pictures they draw, that they may be contemplating hurting somebody. And that's where the money is really in many ways for schools, is doing a really, really good job of identifying students and getting intervention. We've heard our experts say it works, and that's a message that I've heard over and over and over. In terms of specific funding to look at one school versus another, I think that's complex. For example, when you think about active shooters, the data appears to show that they're more likely to impact rural and suburban than urban schools. But I think a lot of them are ultimately personal factors. And schools in general are working really hard on their plant facilities, their training, and these, what we call threat assessment or risk intervention strategies. And there's a number of resources for schools: law enforcement, the New York State Police, Safe Schools New York, people like me, the Board of Cooperative Educational Services has programs and helps schools as well. So there's all kinds of resources available to schools now to look at things. In terms of a specific stream of funding, I can't think of something specifically that relates to threat assessment in schools, but it happens already in many, many different ways.
Thank you, Mike. If I could just give a quick follow-up, part of the question there has to do with the idea of instead of kind of doing these things, instead of having guns in teachers' hands. So what are your thoughts about that issue?
I think that, well, instead of having guns in teachers' hands, I agree with that. I don't think that teachers should be armed. And I say that from a very... Thank you. I'm speaking from a practical perspective. My background is military security. And one of the things that I know, and I would defer to our friends in law enforcement, though, ultimately, is that it takes a lot of training to handle a firearm and to use it correctly and use it safely. That's not something we can do once a year. So there's a very practical component just to, if we wanted somebody to maintain their skills with a firearm. I think the other problem is the safety factor. When the Hudson police, when the sheriffs, New York State Police, we've had schools where the FBI showed up at incidents that we've had. They don't even necessarily know each other. And if somebody steps out in the hallway with a weapon, it may be difficult for police officers to distinguish that person from somebody who's hostile. So I think there's other reasons that Dr. Suttmeier might have as to why teachers ultimately shouldn't be armed, but mine is a practical one. It's about safety, and competency would be a concern. But I think the things that we can do as schools today, because I think that the real solutions are long-term and they're very complex, but the things we do today, we practice, we identify risk, we try to mitigate that risk as early on as we can, and I think there's good systems in this school district for doing that. We practice response actions so that we know what to do if something happens. We work very closely with the police. The school conducts at least 8 drills a year, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And I think we've heard a lot of people say it, but maybe it's a necessary thing while we're working towards the bigger solutions that are available to us.
Great, thank you, Mike. And so to respond to your comment, if we could have Dr. Suttmeier speak to this issue as well, that would be great.
I agree that teachers should not be armed in schools. First of all, that's not their profession. That's not what they are certified to do. They are certified to teach, to work with curriculum and make sure that they're using best practices so that they're delivering that curriculum with instruction that's meaningful for our students. It's not what they're paid to do. Teachers are doing much more than giving the students the knowledge and the skills that they need to be successful in any content area or grade level. We're building relationships with students. We're making sure that they have someone that they feel safe that they can talk to, counseling them, being their friend, sometimes being a parent, if that's what they need on any particular day or year. We strengthen our relationships and make sure that we can reach them to teach them. The one title that a teacher does not have is an officer. They're not an armed guard, and that's not how we should be conducting our educational experiences for our students. And I feel very strongly about that.
Yeah, you'd like to speak to
I'll
that,
add
sure.
to that. As Mike said and Dr. Suttmeier, the teachers should not be armed. They should not be running around with guns. I'm a New York State firearms instructor. I have been for many years. And sending that round down range is a big responsibility. And you really have to have the training and the education. And as Mike said, it's not something that you get once a year. We need to leave that to the professionals. With that being said, this costs money. And this is where I'm hoping that our state representatives that are here today can look at that and see if any funding can be found for school resource deputies to help the schools. Currently, right now, what we do is we split it 50-50. Schools pay half, the county pays half. But it's tough. Budgets are tight. There's restrictions, there's caps, there's so on and so forth that we have to deal with. And I would hope that we could take this back to Albany where they can look and they can say, let's fund some money for the school resource officers. Get the cops in the schools, work with the schools, and have the professionals do the job that we're supposed to do, and that's protect you. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Can I just add that the Smart Schools Bond Act has been specifically reshaped so that money can be used specifically for this. So if Dr. Suttmeier or anyone wants to reach out, we're happy to work with you on making sure that Hudson gets that money.
And Elmer's question, he also requested a response from Congressman Faso, and perhaps you could speak to the issue of national legislation that might be able to help with these issues.
Well, I too, let me just say, I think that from the experts that I've spoken to, the training and the response time and the adrenaline rush that occurs when you're in a active shooter situation, when that officer draws their weapon, it is something that would be very difficult to have someone who is only an incidental gun owner deal in that situation. So I'm in agreement with what the sheriff and Dr. Suttmeier said in terms of whether arming teachers is advisable. What we have done at the congressional level is we've made money available. Again, it's a $75 million in the last appropriation bill nationwide. Is a drop in the bucket, frankly, for what the need is across the nation. But part of those funds could be used for those type of assessments. And I think, though, that from my experience in talking to school superintendents and principals and school board members in the 11 counties that comprise our congressional district, I can tell you that these discussions are already ongoing. And what Mike Needham had indicated is absolutely true. And I think we should all take some reassurance to the fact that communities are having these kind of meetings among their constituencies. And that's really appropriate and very much needed. So I appreciate what Mike is doing, what other professionals are doing to try to help school officials assess the needs that they have in their districts.
Good. Thank you. So our second question comes from Claire Copley, who asks a question regarding the history of arms in our country. And the question is this: the founders of our country could not foresee technological advances when they crafted the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. Can you please discuss the actual practical differences between regulating the ownership and operation of automobiles and regulating firearms? So I guess there's a couple different issues in there. I guess A, speaking to whether the Second Amendment might be a bit antiquated, I'm interpreting the first part, and secondly, what would you think about regulating firearms the same way that we do automobiles? And this is one for all the panelists, so whoever wants to speak first.
Well, I think I'll go first on that. I think the founders could not have contemplated some of the weaponry that exists today, certainly. They couldn't have contemplated jet plane travel, and they couldn't have contemplated the internet. And yet we still are able to manage to deal within the constraints of Commerce Clause and free speech and accommodate these innovations that have occurred over the centuries. I don't think the Second Amendment is outmoded. I fully support the Second Amendment. And I think that what's instructive, I think, is for folks to read the majority and the dissenting opinions in the Heller case, Justice Scalia's majority opinion and the dissenting opinion. I can't recall right now which judge wrote the dissent, but they're both very well crafted. And the Heller case is interesting, and it's interesting in the context of today because in that instance, the District of Columbia had sought to, in essence, bar a citizen from having a engaged active firearm in their home. In other words, you had to basically disable the firearm in their home in order to comply with the DC statute. Mr. Heller was a security guard, a licensed armed security guard at a federal office building in Washington, DC, and he objected to this especially since he was licensed. What the District of Columbia wanted to do was basically take away his Second Amendment rights. And Justice Scalia traced the history of the Second Amendment back to the 1650s in England. And the bottom line is that the Second Amendment, as Justice Scalia said, is not open-ended. It is not a blank check. There can be limits that the government can rationally place on firearm ownership and use. And indeed, the government has done that from time to time. I mentioned the high regulation that automatic weapons came about after the 1920s and 30s, the gangland, the Al Capone situations. So machine guns, as we commonly know them, are outlawed. When you hear people talk about the use of automatic weapons today, well, they're actually incorrect because semi-automatics are legal. Automatic weapons are very highly regulated and indeed illegal in most contexts. So I do think that we have to be rational about this discussion. I mean, the SAFE Act is something that many people objected to in New York State, and the SAFE Act, in essence, enacted certain bans on certain semi-automatic weapons. And if you go and Google SAFE Act compliant semi-automatics, you will find a whole host of weapons that are legal in New York State that have all of the firing capacity of a semi-automatic that is now illegal under New York law. But this semi-automatic SAFE Act compliant weapon is commonly available. In fact, the shooter that went into a Bronx hospital a year ago or 2 years ago had a SAFE Act compliant semi-automatic weapon. So I think what the important thing here is for us to recognize that shooter in Florida, in Parkland, that young man should never have been able to buy a BB gun, much less a semi-automatic or any other kind of firearm. Numerous people dropped the ball, whether it was the FBI, which had 2 explicit warnings about this individual, whether it was the local law enforcement, which had gone to this young man's home about 30 times, whether it was the school, which had expelled this individual for violence against a teacher, and they refused to prosecute him because they didn't want to give him a record. Well, now we see what the consequences of that were. So there are many, many issues that arise with the modern day usage of the Second Amendment as the modern day usage of the Commerce Clause and the Free Speech Amendment, etc. We can accommodate our needs for safety and security, maintain a Second Amendment and our constitutional rights, and do this in a logical, coherent way so that we're protected, but the rights of law-abiding people who overwhelmingly are not the people that commit crimes with firearms are protected.
Great. Thank you, Congressman. Other panelists who'd like to speak to this, and again, it's a two-pronged question. A, dealing with the whether the Second Amendment is still an appropriate policy for our nation, and B, whether guns should be regulated the same way that automobiles are regulated. Any other panelists want to speak to that? Okay, moving forward. Next question. Very similar question. I'm going to go with the next one. This comes from Fran Miller, directly for Congressman Faso. Congressman Faso, given that you have been the recipient of funding from the NRA, how is it that you can say you're supporting the current drive to end gun violence Will you promise tonight to refuse to take campaign donations from the NRA?
Well, the fact of the matter is that the National Rifle Association and sportsmen's groups in our district represent tens of thousands of people. And I have won the support of local sportsmen, whether they're NRA members or not. And I think the problem inherent in the question, it assumes that one's support in politics is somehow contingent upon receipt of campaign donations. And such a thing, well, I will count you as unpersuaded. The fact of the matter is that this is a red herring, and the question is a bit of a red herring. And what I would suggest.
Sorry, if we could allow the Congressman to respond.
And the bottom line is that my support for the Second Amendment and for sportsmen in our district and across the country has nothing to do with receipt of campaign contribution. It has to do with the fact that I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, and that includes all 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment. And the sportsmen in our district, who are overwhelmingly law-abiding citizens, what is the problem with folks that want to castigate the sportsmen and the gun owners is they fail to understand that new laws being passed to restrict the rights of law-abiding people are not going to affect what the people who already disobey the laws will do. The prisons are filled with people who commit crimes with illegally obtained weapons. The prisons are not filled with law-abiding citizens who by definition obey the law. And so what we have to do is we've got to get beyond this divide between those that support the Second Amendment and those who think it should be much more narrowly restricted. And we need to address the things like I am trying to do in Congress. I am the lead sponsor of a bill to reauthorize school-based health clinics, bringing primary, dental, and mental health services to schools that currently don't have those kind of services. And because the mental health issues dealing with bullying and anxiety and alienation that exists in this media-centric society that we live in, I think that goes to the key of what we've got to address. And I also think this is an area where people on both sides of the firearms debate, good people of good faith, could find common ground to solve this problem. And so that's why I earnestly ask people on both sides of this issue to work together to solve this problem.
Thank you.
Yes or no? Yes or no about the money?
So I guess there's a specific request of yes or no to that element of the question.
The answer is no.
Moving on, we've got a question from our friend Leo Wilcox. It's a detailed question, and this goes to several panelists. My husband is a gun owner and veteran. We live on a small farm in Columbia County. We think there are common sense solutions that will stop people with dangerous histories from buying guns. As long as we allow gun sales to happen without a background check, it will remain far too easy to buy a gun. With a recent poll showing 97% of gun owners support H.R. 4240, the Public Safety and Second Amendment Rights Protection Act, a bill that requires criminal background checks on all commercial gun sales, and has 208 co-sponsors, including 2 Republicans from New York. Will you join them and co-sponsor that particular bill? So this initially goes to Congressman Faso.
I'm not familiar with the legislation. I'll take a look at it, but the point of the vast majority of firearm sales the firearm sales done with commercial dealers all have to be subject to a background check. New York State already has even more extensive rules than what the federal government has. The difference in terms of background checks is whether or not a transfer between a family member, one to another, should be subject to a background check. And I think there you'll find most people, the polls are much closer on that topic, not the 98% or 97% that you mentioned.
Great, thank you. Others named here are Dr. Suttmeier and David Bartlett, if you'd like to speak to this issue.
Background checks are good. I mean, we run all the background checks on all the pistol permits that come in. We vet everybody. If there's any issues, it gets forwarded to the county judges, and the judges decide whether or not they're gonna get a permit. The mental health checks are good. You know, people just don't go out and buy guns and get handed guns and go do what you gotta do with it. So, I mean, I absolutely agree that background checks are good. And it's being done already, like the Congressman said. I just went and bought a blue pistol the other day. First thing they did was to go through the FBI. And they, I'm a sheriff in the county, and I went through all the paperwork and had to be checked.
Thank you. Dr. Suttmeier.
Yes, I agree that limitations, a background check makes sense. We're reasonable people, and we need to start practicing some reasonable procedures in allowing people to buy a firearm. It's responsible use, but I would also say that it's access to guns too. Some of the people that are creating this mayhem and violence are not the ones that purchase the guns, but they have access to the guns. So we have to make sure that they're secure and that those that have legally obtained the guns are keeping them secure and keeping them away from children that should not be able to access them in their homes. So we need to work together as a community to make sure that who that gun was sold to stays with the person and that there's been a background check and they are using it responsibly.
Thank you. So I guess one follow-up that I have in my role as moderator speaks to the fact that a lot of the answers to that question and some of these other questions pertain to the fact that this is New York State. And New York State is pretty well known across the country for having pretty tight, relatively tight gun laws. And concurrent with that, we also have a proportionate low number of, smaller amount of gun violence. An analysis that I actually conducted within the last couple of months, there's a very strong relationship between how strict gun laws are and the number of deaths by guns in that particular state. Related to this, and again, this is a question that that a few folks have asked me to raise. Congressman Faso is a co-sponsor of House Bill 38, which is titled the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, which relates to national level legislation. So Congressman Faso, if you could speak to your thoughts on that bill, as well as we can get some feedback from others as well.
Yeah, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act would allow a valid firearm owner from one state to travel across the border to another state without violating that state's law. Now, the key here is that any person in that situation must abide by the laws and regulations of the state in which he or she is traveling. So that does not change that. It is akin to having a driver's license in one state, being licensed in one state and driving in another. You must obey the laws of that other state. This legislation is naturally controversial. And I think that it's unlikely to pass both houses of the Congress. But I think it has been overstated the negative impact in the minds of many people as to what it would actually do. Again, people who lawfully possess firearms are not, overwhelmingly, are not the people that commit crimes with those firearms. Now, what Dr. Suttmeier said about making sure that there is safe storage of firearms in a home, absolutely, I think all of us agree with that. And if you look at the incident down in Santa Fe, Texas, and I have not heard the situation explicitly in terms of what the father apparently owned the shotgun and the .38 caliber handgun. But I've not heard what the situation was and how that young man got access to those. But clearly, I would think there would be some liability attaching to the father for not safely storing those firearms in his home and allowing his son to have access to it. But again, I think overwhelmingly the problem with much of the discussion about gun laws in the United States is that the people that these laws are aimed against are overwhelmingly not the people that are the cause of the problem. Thank you.
So I'm curious if there are any other panelists that might want to speak to that. I'm specifically thinking of our law enforcement folks, if you have some thoughts that you might want to chime in on.
The only thing I'll add is we had, folks are aware we had 7 shootings in Hudson last summer, very violent summer. None of the dozen or so weapons we seized over the year were registered firearms. All were stolen. Some were not even reported stolen. The thing about a handgun is it'll last for 100 years. They don't go away. It's important that that when we do make these arrests, we gather information. We're very aggressive at getting warrants to get these guns off the street. But it's clear that none of the perpetrators from last summer ever took a background investigation.
I echo what the chief said. We were involved with everything that was going on. It was a mess down here. And it's sad because the people that live here in this city are great people. And the city police worked so hard on that case, along with state police, my agency, federal agencies. And those people, they weren't law-abiding citizens. They were just getting their weapons, stealing them. A lot of the crimes that we see, I don't want to jinx myself here, but out in the county, we really haven't had a lot of shootings. Stabbings, some type of a personal weapon, hands, feet. So we're been lucky we haven't seen that. But last year was a mess, and it's just such a shame that the good people that are law-abiding people living here and obeying the laws, they have to deal with the crap that this particular group, 2 groups actually, did all last summer. I was on many search warrants. I was on many calls of shots fired, making sure that my brothers and sisters were safe. So I echo what the chief said.
Great, thank you, Didi. So we're now at the point, I don't know where our friend Billy is, but we're now at the point where we're going to take the open-ended questions from the audience. So there's our friend Billy Hughes coming down. And so, Billy, you have a process for collecting questions.
Yeah, we changed it up a little bit. Okay, so we changed it up a little bit because we saw when we were receiving questions, people didn't put their names on. So we're going to be a little daring here and open it up for people to come up and ask questions. Again, I'm going to lay the groundwork. We want people to be respectful. When you ask a question, you will ask a question and step back to receive your answer. There will be no rebuttal. We are not entering into a debate with the people on this panel. We are trying to have a civil discussion, and so far we're having a great time, right? Yeah. Being educated, so thank you. So we will open it up for questions. And the first thing I'd like to say, do we have any school administrators or students in here who would like to ask questions? I would like to give preference to them first. If so possible. State your name and then ask your question.
My name is Althea Brennan. I'm a junior at Chatham High School, and I am a volunteer and intern on the Roads campaign. And this is a question for Congressman Faso. So directly after the Parkland shooting, obviously there was a lot of engagement with young people regarding the sadness and grief and anger that we had over the loss of lives of our peers in Florida and the broader issue of gun violence. And a lot of us went and reached for people in power to sort of voice our anger and, sort of barter for answers and solutions. And I definitely found an ear with Gareth Rhodes. He sat down with me extensively and spoke with me about my own concerns and his ideas for solutions. But obviously we also garnered the inertia of the Parkland students and their movement, and I organized the walkout at my school. which was really successful. We had around 80 students at Chatham walk out in protest of the fear that we face every day going to school, knowing that we could be next. And in response to that, Congressman Faso, you said that our walkout was a loss of valuable academic time to the Register Star. So my question to you is, how is our 17-minute protest a loss of academic time any different from the loss of academic time we face 5 to 8 times a year for 45 minutes huddled in the corner of a classroom, waiting for law enforcement to check if we can be seen from the door in the case of an active shooter drill, or the countless hours we face in fear that our school could be next to be shot at? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your activism and thank you for your concern. It is vital that young people be participants in this debate. And I appreciate that question, but you took my quote and only took a portion of it. What I said was that the walkout question was something that the students and their parents and the schools would decide. And in response to a question follow-up from the reporter asking me, I believe in this, if it's the paper I'm remembering, about the potential loss of time, I said, well, that's the loss of academic time is always a concern, but that's something that will have to be decided locally. So I appreciate your activism and your energy, and I'll be happy to sit down and talk with you about these issues if you'd like. Thank you so much.
Love that.
My name is Hedvig Lockwood. Okay. Probably to Congressman Faso and anybody else who has any insights here. I just wonder if there's any studying being done officially on how certain other countries who have very high gun ownership, very extensive, and very low gun violence, how they do that. I've read up a little bit on it, and it's a whole lot different than what we do here. So I was wondering if there's any study or consideration going on to such a question. Thank you.
Well, I think that's a really good question. And one of the things that has been considered or been discussed is whether or not the CDC is banned by the so-called Didi Amendment from actually studying the sources of gun violence. And as was made plain in this year's appropriation bill, the CDC is not barred from having such a study. The CDC is barred from advocating one way or the other about quote-unquote gun control. But they certainly are not barred from considering the sources of violence, what might be the causes of violence, and I certainly support that. Again, I think if you go back to it, and it's back to what Mike said, and he's more expert than I, certainly, but this is a group of individuals that are overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, almost 100%, they are young men or they are boys, they're adolescents that are committing these crimes. And what is it that is motivating them? What are the factors in society that are affecting them? What are the degrees of alienation, whether it's bullying, whether it's social media, etc. All of these things are factors that did not exist when most of us in this room were growing up. They exist now today for the young people today. And these are some things that we as adults and as an older generation should try to understand. And we should listen to the voices of the younger people who are being so directly affected by this in their classrooms and their communities. And so I think some broader study of this question as to what is behind, what are the sources of this alienation, this dissatisfaction that these young boys and young men are feeling. And I think that is something that would truly address this. Notice there are not a lot of girls committing these crimes, not a lot of young women committing these crimes. And so we really need to focus on these boys and adolescent boys and young men as to what is behind this.
Yeah, Didi?
I guess I would like to look at this issue in a different way. I think that suicide, which is often the case, is girls growing up, and kids getting killed on the way to school because they live in a community where there are active guns, is also gun violence. And that, Congressman, is not just boys of that certain age. And I think we really need to look at this in a much broader way when we're looking at the number of deaths among young people from gun violence. It's not just what's happened in these, in these schools, in these mass shootings that grab the headlines. It's something that's happening every day in the city of Poughkeepsie, just, outside my district. This is not something that's uniquely about a phenomenon of mass shootings. This is gun violence that's happening pervasively in the United States of America. And I think it's time that we do something about it.
We have another respondent. I think Mike wants to speak to this.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd answer it. Why not be interested in hearing your perspective?
Sure. Okay, yeah, I'd be glad to speak to this. I actually happened to have published an article on this relatively recently. Speaking to the question had to do with how do other countries deal with this? What's different? To some extent, you're asking, I think, what's different about what's here versus in other nations. There's a famous example, I'm not sure if it was the 1980s or the 1990s, I forget the date, but there was one year where there was a major mass shooting in Scotland that was in a school where dozens of kids were killed, and a similar shooting in a public space in Australia where dozens of people were killed with semi-automatic weapons, if I recall correctly. I believe that is accurate. And both of those nations, within months, put in national level legislation that made for very stringent rules on firearms, and there have been very close to zero, if not zero, mass shootings in the schools in those countries since. So we do have data on that.
Well, I feel like we go back in circles. We talk about other countries and how their process and their legislation and policies about guns. We have amendment of the Second Amendment, how we have our right to own guns, and if we didn't have that, we just clear cut, normal guns, and it's canceled right there. We don't have this kind of debate going on. But because we have our amendments, there are people who own guns and are good people, and there's people who have guns that don't do the right thing. So that's we have to find common ground, like you guys said, and how we can work our way from there.
Hi, I'm Pookie Amsterdam. I'm from Hudson, and thank you all for coming, and I really mean that. Thank you all for coming. The tobacco industry, that's heavily regulated, and I have the right to the pursuit of happiness. But if I was to light up a cigarette here, there are laws that would stop me. And the tobacco industry, I just wonder why the will to regulate secondhand smoke is so much bigger than the will to make sure that someone with mental health problems or a history of domestic violence might be able to get an assault weapon, even a military assault weapon. It seems that responsible gun owners, and you're right, the majority of people who own guns are not going out there shooting up children in school or committing crime, killing other people. Why would any responsible gun owner have a problem with responsible gun ownership laws? No one, when they passed the regulations on cigarettes, no one got up and screamed, "They're coming to take my smokes. They're coming to take my cigarettes." It's the same thing. No one wants to take people's guns. No one, right? We don't want to take anyone's guns away. What we want and need is responsible gun ownership laws, which should be embraced by the majority of responsible gun owners so that people with problems don't kill their kids.
Hi, I'm Nadine Gazzola. I'm actually a board member of a district in Columbia County. Actually, my question's for Assemblymember Barrett. You said the Smart Schools Bond Act is changing so that schools can request more money. I'm just wondering, how is that going to work? Because some schools are still waiting for the requests that they put in almost a year ago to do security upgrades that can't be done because the money's not being given from the state.
You should come and see us. My office is right on Warren Street. I'm happy to talk to you about how we can help with that because we've been reaching out on behalf of other school districts to make that money appear faster.
My name is Terry Lasky. I live in Chatham, New York, and I've heard a lot more talk tonight about background checks than I have about gun control, the idea of gun control. I do background checks for a living. I've done them for decades. I do them for big corporations. I do them in criminal cases. I do them in civil cases. I've done them even before computers existed. And one thing that I know, one thing that I learned was that when you do a background check on, say, a young person who wants a job in a big company and he's 21 years old, there's very little information there. You may develop a portrait of this person, but you're not going to be able to predict what a 21-year-old or a 20-year-old is going to do wrong in a public space, whether he's going to steal from his employer, whether he's going to take out an AR-15, which he's entitled to buy, and use that gun. So background checks are an art, not a science. You can't rely on them for in this particular on these particular issues. What do you think of that, Mr. Faso?
Well, I'm not sure what your question is, but maybe you can.
Shall I rephrase it?
Sure.
What do you think of the fact that you can find out very little? I think law enforcement will agree. There's much less of a paper trail on those who are 21 years old than those who are, say, 28 years old. How do you decide that since there's nothing untoward in their background, that they should be able to possess a weapon?
Well, for instance, and I think the sheriff and the chief can also address this as well, in terms of an application for someone who is coming in to obtain a pistol. Well, they've got to be 21 or over in New York State to obtain a pistol. And they've got to have an interview, and they've got to, that application has got to go through, you could describe, I think, what you do in such a situation where you get an application for a pistol permit, because there are references, those references are checked, and ultimately it has to go before a judge. And the judge sometimes will ask to interview the individual. But you are correct, there is no perfect system that we could create in this context. But I do think that one of the things that in the employment context we're finding with young people today, they leave a trail on Facebook, and that is often something that is.
May I respond to that?
Well,
No?
Well, why don't we let you finish this up and then.
yeah, when someone's looking for a job, for instance, they'll leave a trail on Facebook, and that may or may not give you much information. But many employers are noticeably reticent to hire people when they see certain things on Facebook. Now, this is not going to get into I don't think anyone's doing Facebook checks on firearms applications. I don't believe so. So you raise a good point, but the point is that none of these systems are going to be perfect. But the background check system has had some significant flaws, and one of those was the one I referenced earlier, where the dishonorably discharged Air Force veteran who had committed domestic violence was never reported to the background check system. And the Congress, on a bipartisan basis, closed that loophole. And I think that's an important thing for us to have done.
Our moderator pointed out earlier that states with strict gun laws have much lower. Our moderator pointed out that states that have strict gun laws have much lower death rates due to gun violence, and we're lucky we live in New York State. And last year, the New York State Office of the Attorney General reported that over 70% of guns recovered from crime scenes in the state came from guns from states with lax gun laws. To protect the citizens in New York, what legislation, Congressman Faso, would you propose to curtail the impact of the iron pipeline? For example, would you support nationwide universal background checks that close the gun show loophole like New York State has done successfully? As another example, would you provide funding to the ATF to help them identify and prosecute gun shops that routinely sell to straw purchasers and to gun runners, two things that might help close down the...
And those are good questions. The second part, I thought you were applauding for me, I guess it wasn't. The second part was, actually, the Justice Department has taken renewed efforts. They are now prosecuting people who lie on background checks. There are about 3,000 people annually who give false information on background checks. That is a felony. And up until this year, no one ever prosecuted them. The Justice Department is now going after people who do that. Secondly, they're also going after much more vigorously those that would be straw purchasers, who would, like the person in Monroe County a couple of years ago, who purchased a firearm for a convicted felon who would not have passed a background check. And that convicted felon around Christmas, you may recall this about 3 years ago, set his house on fire, set someplace of the dwelling on fire, and then he killed 2 first responders who came to that scene. And that individual who was the straw purchaser has herself been prosecuted and put in prison. But the Justice Department has, only recently, and this is only in the last year, they are really going much more vigorously at those people. And I support much more vigorous prosecution of, it's already against many existing laws, what you're seeing in terms of the so-called iron pipeline of guns that come up to New York from Virginia or North Carolina, etc. So I think you're right, those things should be prosecuted and those would be really important. I think on the background check question that you answered, or you asked about, as I mentioned before, the vast majority of firearm sales at gun shows are subject to background checks, and we should potentially look at those that I think it's 10 or fewer. If someone makes 10 or fewer sales in a year, that could potentially be subject to that. But the fact is, we're dealing with incidental sales. The main thing, when people say universal background checks, what they're saying is that the father or the grandfather has got to have a background check in order to transfer his firearm to his son or grandson or daughter. And that I don't support, because I think that's an unreasonable restriction on their right.
Hi, my name is Judy Catton. I'm from Old Chatham, New York. Congressman Faso, you have told this audience that you will not accept money from the NRA, and you've also said that your decisions in voting.
No, I didn't say that. I said I've received modest contributions from the NRA, and I'm not going to stop accepting those modest contributions.
Okay, and you've also said that accepting money from interest groups doesn't impact. Can you tell this audience 2-3 times where you have opposed the NRA, where you have stood up and opposed their public positions?
Well, I have, for instance, been working on this red flag legislation, which the NRA has raised opposition to. I think the red flag legislation is something that's reasonable, because so long as you protect due process rights, we can't, because we might strongly feel about something, toss away someone's constitutional right. Everyone in America is entitled to due process under the law. This is why we live in the United States of America. The government can't just come in and say, I think you, Ms. Kent, are someone who's dangerous, and we're going to come into your home and take your firearm away. That is not what we do here. We have to have due process. And so I support a red flag statute like they have in Indiana, which has been successfully used multiple times, many times in that state, to take firearms away from people if they are judged by a court after due process of being a danger to themselves or a danger to others. And I think that's something that most people on both sides of this argument could agree with. But so you know, it's not a question of whether or not I support the NRA or not. I support the Second Amendment, and I support the sportsmen and women in this county. Have you ever visited? Not you. I'm sorry, ma'am. Just rhetorically. Have the people that are so vigorously wanting to take away or restrict those Second Amendment rights ever gone to a sportsman's club and talked to the sportsmen and worked with them and talked to them about this? Some of you may have done that, but others, I find many people that make pronouncements about firearms often don't know the first thing about firearms. And it's very important for people to actually understand the issue that motivates the firearms owners, the sportsmen, and what they do for recreation, for enjoyment, for hunting, etc., and for personal protection.
Congressman Faso, I'm sorry, I'm just going to ask just a quick follow-up to that. Just from my perspective, what do you say to people who say that the Second Amendment is not about individuals having guns for hunting-related purposes, but rather is for the well-regulated militia, which is the first clause, that these might be independent things?
I would say read Justice Scalia's majority opinion, and that reflects my opinion in that regard. It is, I think, scholarly, and it is authoritative, and it also is the majority law in our country.
My name is Peter Greeno. I'm from Millerton in Dutchess County. I was raised hunting. I used to have to hunt for food when my father was out of work. We hunted rabbits and rattlesnakes and other things in California, lived rurally. I grew up with guns. I took NRA training in an armory, lying on a mattress, practiced target shooting into one of those target things inside the armory that caught the bullets. I know about guns. I've used them all my life. I can shoot traps and whatever.
Can you speak more into the microphone?
Yes, sorry.
Hold up.
Okay. And the thing that bothers me is that guns have become a wedge issue. They're used politically. The issue has been weaponized. And there are a lot of individuals that use the issue as a weapon. They're using that weapon, not a gun. They're using the issue as a weapon against our society. We are now at war with one another. This is one of the issues that suits one of the parties. I know you're from Long Island. You didn't grow up with guns. I did. It bothers me that you, among other people, have weaponized an issue for political purposes. And everybody knows that the NRA backs you, backs this issue, uses it as a weapon. What do you say? What do you say? Do the right thing. Forget party.
Respectfully, sir, you are accusing me of doing something which you just did yourself. And in actuality, this is one of the troubles in this country. You just got up and accused me of weaponizing this issue, and I have not done so in my entire public life. And I would note, Glenn, it's not been since 1986. I haven't interacted in there, if you know, for 12 years. The fact of the matter is that this is the trouble in America today. The left watches MSNBC and CNN, and the right watches Fox and listens. And this is what they do. Or they shout out and don't allow the person to respond to what they just said. You should sit and listen, sir, because this is the issue in America. The issue in America is that the left and the right aren't talking to each other about these issues. And with all due respect, we are not going to solve this as Americans if we just go into our respective corners. No, ironically, in the United States House of Representatives, out of 435 members, I am ranked number 18, or in the top 5%, of being the most bipartisan members of the House. And the fact is that there are people who are on the far side of either equation, whether it's on immigration, who say every immigration solution is amnesty, or on the other side who say basically have open borders. People don't understand the dynamic of trying to get something done in Congress, and also the dynamic of eliminating this polarization that exists in our society. And unless we are willing to talk across party lines, and I am doing that in Washington, unless we're willing to talk to people that we don't agree with and listen to their point of view, we don't get things done. And that's basically the biggest problem in our country today, this polarization. So all I can tell you is that I'm working hard to try to bridge these gaps that exist between the parties and among people, because there's no other way as Americans we can solve our problems.
This question is for the elected officials and law enforcement. Sorry. Congressman Faso just talked about the requirements for licensing a handgun in New York State, which seemed entirely reasonable to me. And so, likewise, I know the state of Massachusetts has a requirement that you have to have a trigger lock on your weapons. I do. So my question to law enforcement and elected officials is this. Would you support the process, licensing process that Congressman Faso just described for pistols, for all weapons? And would you support legislation like Massachusetts that requires every gun to have a trigger lock or be disabled? Thank you.
Yes.
I think every gun owner, every weapon owner should be responsible for the guns that they have, whether they're secured. I have 1,000-pound safe in my house. Every one of my weapons are locked down. Every one of my weapons are secure. I'm responsible for those guns. So they need to be secured, yes.
Should that be mandatory?
It's going to be up to the legislature. I mean, as a responsible gun owner, you secure your gun. I don't leave it laying around. I've got 2 little kids at home. Somebody breaks into my house, my biggest fear is somebody breaks into my house, they get my gun, they take it out of the streets, they get down here in the streets and try to shoot me. That's one of my biggest fears.
Should it be mandatory in your opinion?
It's up to the legislature. It's not up to me, I'm just one.
Edward, if we could have your thoughts on that?
That's just common sense, isn't it?
Congressman Faso, if you could also speak to that question.
I would not support the same type of registration system for hunting rifles, etc. I don't think that is something that's called for. I do think that firearms training and safety, however, and proper storage is something that should be required. So I believe, as both the chief and the sheriff said, that firearms security and proper storage is something that is a must for firearms owners, particularly if you have young children at home.
Hey, my name is Kenneth, and I wanted to talk to Ms. Suttmeier. When we were doing that campaign, I talked to them about if we go outside. But I know that sometimes that it can be disruptive, but that was a really big thing for us.
I didn't hear everything you said. You said something about campaign outside?
So I think his question was, you guys must have had a campaign on the Parkland rally, and apparently they weren't allowed to go outside. So he was asking how come they couldn't go outside and participate.
Yes, so our number one priority is our student safety. So administration spoke with the student council members and talked about how we wanted to do this. We did not stop our students. We're not going to stop them from speaking out about something that is so important to them. We helped them to organize it and let them lead it, and we were very proud. It just so happened that there was snow outside. We did let them plan to be out on our new track and field. We didn't want them to be out on Harry Howard Avenue because it just wasn't a way that we could keep them safe. But it turned out that the weather was inclement, so we had to bring the walkout inside in the auditorium. But the students were allowed to leave their classrooms, come into this auditorium, and have a voice. And I don't know if there was another day in this district, and I've been here for a long time, that I've been more proud of our young people that came together and really gave a lot of research and thought and heart into everything that they had to say and to share. And we allowed the media here to hear it. And it didn't stop here, so you don't have to walk outside to be heard. They walked out of classrooms, they organized themselves, and were invited on our local radio station, WGXC, and were able to speak to a wider audience as a result of the walkout that we did provide for the students. And I think they were invited to come back and take over the entire show the week later because they did such a great job. So, you know, there's a lot of ways to express how you feel, and I don't necessarily feel that it is my job to allow an unsafe environment for such things.
For those who don't know me, my last name is Nance, N-A-S-T-K-E. My family runs Shooter Sporting Goods up in Galatia. I want to bring to everybody's attention, David Bartlett had came to our store and purchased a firearm. He was through the same background check that we constantly. There's questions here about background searches. In this situation right here, or in this auditorium, I probably do more background searches than anybody in this county. The whole family's involved with it. We've had people that get approved, we have people that get denied, we have people that are excused. Okay? Is it foolproof? It's as close as perfect as we can possibly have with today's situations. And I want to thank all of you to be up there and have the courage to be in this room. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Andrew Gare, a freshman at Loopholes High School. And this question is directed to John Faso. So you claim that the government and school districts are addressing the issue of gun violence. And I think there's continuously been, relentlessly, they keep happening. There's been 22 this year. And every single time the government says, they make a promise to end it and then it won't happen again. And statistically speaking, it's just not working. Like, what has transpired since the Santa Fe shooting that the government will take action to do to stop more shootings from taking place?
One school shooting is too many. But I would caution you in terms of how you arrived at the number you cited. That is a CNN number. And if you get into the details of it, the number actually includes a number of things that most people wouldn't classify as a school shooting. So but one school shooting is too many. And we've had these string of events, and then you have the copycats. So I do think what we have to do is we have to better address the sources of this issue. And I think the main source of the issue is the alienation and disaffection of adolescent boys and young men who are overwhelmingly, these are the people that are committing these crimes. So I think it's a combination of mental health. I think it's a combination of better school-based health systems that include mental health. It's a combination of better awareness among schools and community leaders as to what is the status of security. It is discussions with law enforcement and with security experts to make sure that all of these things are taking place. And indeed, I think that overwhelmingly, no matter where you are, or no matter where anyone in this audience is on the whole question of gun control or Second Amendment rights, everyone wants to make sure that our schools are safer, that our children do not have to face this fear and anxiety that all too many of them in our society face today. So I am fully in support of what we are trying to do. All of us in this audience, I think tonight, are fully in support of safer schools where our children can go and be safe and get an education and not have this anxiety, and that their parents aren't sending them off on a daily basis worrying about whether or not there might be an incident in their schools. I don't think there's anyone in this audience that disagrees with that.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. My name is Thea Burgess. I've been a public school teacher for 28 years. I started here at Hudson. I taught English here for 12 years, and now I teach down in Red Hook. I actually taught Chief Moore's sons, and one of your officers, Chief David Miller, was my student as well. So school safety is incredibly important to me and my students, and I think one of the major problems or one of the major changes that's occurred since the 1970s when we went to school is the proliferation of semi-automatic weapons. And I've called, Congressman Faso, I've called your office several times, and your staff is very courteous and very kind when I call. But I am very supportive of a ban on semi-automatic weapons. When I was in high school, I grew up in Otsego County, Untitled High School, and there was an incident where there was a gun in the school. That was because a deer jumped through the principal's window and a state trooper had to come and shoot the deer. That was not frightening, except to the secretary. I was also, when I taught here at Hudson, there was an incident where a police officer was chasing someone who had a gun. He ran into the school, and the school custodian tackled him, and we were in a lockdown situation there. I think that situation would have turned out very differently if there had been a semi-automatic weapon involved. We've been taught in our training, and I don't know if this still is an accurate statistic, but if there is a lockdown that is put into process, we have about 5 to 8 minutes before the police will arrive. When there is a semi-automatic weapon involved, those 5 to 8 minutes can be astronomically dangerous and deadly. And I look at my students and I think to myself, well, I have the courage to do what I need to do to protect them. And when they ask me what can be done, I say we need to contact our officials, but there's not much more than I can say. And you can tell I'm getting emotional about this, but when we talk about hardening our schools, I don't think we need to do that as much as to look at common sense gun control. I'm not saying take away all weapons. I know there are many, many sportsmen. My father, my grandparents were hunters, but that just the sheer number of semi-automatic weapons that are out in the streets is frightening. And it's not just in schools, it's at the movie theater, or it's at a concert, and I just wonder what your positions are on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And I think the issue we have to face is what can we effectively do to deal with the question of firearm violence that exists in our country. Billy, could you move over a little bit? That's right, because the ladies. Here's the problem. New York State, for instance, banned so-called assault weapons. But if you go online, as I mentioned before, you can purchase a SAFE Act compliant semi-automatic rifle in New York State, and it's fully legal under the SAFE Act. You would have to, there are some 5 million AR-15s in circulation in the United States of America. And semi-automatic weapons are ubiquitous. The shooter that went into Virginia Tech didn't have a rifle, he had a semi-automatic handgun. The law enforcement that are here tonight, on their holsters, on their hips, is a semi-automatic handgun. And the ubiquity of the semi-automatic weapon is something that it sounds like an easy fix if we were to quote-unquote ban it. Well, indeed, Congress did it at one time. For 12 years, there was a ban on semi-automatic so-called assault rifles. Again, not all semi-automatic rifles, but ones that fit the cosmetic description of what looked like an evil, bad weapon called an assault rifle. And during that time, the Justice Department analyzed the ban and found that it had a negligible, if any, effect upon gun violence. And at the time when the semi-automatic ban was in effect for those 12 years, I think there were 1.5 million semi-automatic rifles in existence at the time of the ban. And it didn't ban ones already in circulation, just new ones. Now there are 5 million AR-15s alone, not to mention the others. These bans simply don't work. And from my political opponents will say, well, they want to reenact the ban. Well, you know what? When President Obama and the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress in 2009 and 2010, they did nothing about this either, because of the difficulty of actually writing a law that would actually deal with this, because the semi-automatic feature is very prevalent. And I know the sheriff and the chief can confirm this. I mean, it is more of a political rhetorical exercise than in actually practically dealing with this issue. That is what my fear is about that. And that's why I'm focused on where can we find common ground with people on both sides of this gun debate to find areas where we can agree that will deal with the specific source of the problem, whether it's mental health, whether it's making sure our schools are safer, and I do think school resource officers are important, etc.
In the interest of time, why don't we take one final question and then we can wrap up, and I'm sure some of the panelists will be willing to hang around for some follow-up.
Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you, Bill, for organizing this. My name is Terry Sullivan. I'm a newly elected board member of the Untitled School District. Thank you. The past couple of months, I've been campaigning and listening to parents from all over the district and listening to students as well. And one of the things that I've heard, and this is a theme that has been echoing in my head, is about this bullying situation that's going on in the schools. There's bullying from student to student. I've heard bullying of teachers to students. There's a student up there, Michael, also from mental health. I think that getting to the root of the problem with the gun issue may have to do with all of the buildup of the bullying and how kids are dealing with it today. And how can we address that before it even gets to the point of a shooting incident? Or, some of these kids, they're so ready to explode. They're either going to take out their anger on themselves and commit suicide, or they're going to take it out on students in the school. So how can we address it even before it gets to that point? Thank you.
I thank any panelists who have thoughts on that can chime in.
Bullying, when you look at the factors involving active shooters, perceiving that you were the target of bullying, whether it's accurate or not, is one of the factors, and we know that that's a factor in self-harm. And there's a lot of parallels there between self-harm and hurting other people, and the leakage is the same. A few years ago, New York State enacted a piece of legislation called the Dignity for All Students Act, which is powerful because when you go to that list of factors, most of them don't actually belong to the school, like a lack of social bonds, access to means of extreme violence, access to guns, that the inability to deal with failure. Well, those are broader issues than the schools, but the bullying specifically, we know has historically been a problem in schools and in other places. So the state enacted this legislation, Dignity for All Students Act, and essentially what it does is it says that the school district has to prevent bullying and harassment in every form. Like they give a list of restrictions. You can't allow bullying and harassment against a child on the basis of their national origin, the way their weight, their height, whether they have facial hair, for any reason. And there's a reporting process in every school district to address that through Dignity Act coordinators. And the school district is required to investigate that to an end point. They have to determine whether there was bullying or harassment. If there is, it has to be resolved by any mechanism necessary. I mean, could you change the entire school culture in some situations? And it also creates a lot of liability for schools. These often, in my experience, go to court in some of these cases, and the sympathies are generally with the student in those cases. So school districts are under tremendous scrutiny. There's also reporting mechanisms that schools, the Chronicles and Hudson, don't do this. They have to report the number of incidents that they investigated. So, and you can find this information, by the way, right on every school district's website, the reporting mechanisms and those things. And certainly there's gray in those areas. Like if you stand in the hallway of any high school and you listen to the interactions between students and people, you could hear things, but where there's this pervasive component of every school employee, it's not like mandatory reporting where we're talking about certified staff. Every school employee must report bullying and harassment in any form. They have to do it immediately, they have to do it in writing. So there's a legislative process that I think it's well in. I was the poster child for that piece of legislation with a young woman from South Hadley on herself, the average girl. She wasn't just bullied, she was methodically bullied. And ultimately, she took her own life. And what you have to ask yourself is, no adult maybe knew about this, because shame on us, we're bystanders, and that's a really important idea that we can't stand by and watch those things happen. So there's a legislative process for addressing that. And I think that every school district that I work with, from Rockland to Queensbury, takes that issue very seriously, as obviously you do as a board member. And so there's certainly a process. And I think there's change. I see change. So that's a very important issue within the school community, because that's one that we hope that's ours, to the extent that it happens here or it happens in social media and comes here.
Thank you, Mike. Sadiq, you'd like to speak to that?
Yes, nowadays we don't like to call it bullying, we like to call it roasting, you know. We just joke around and say negative comments about each other, whether it's how you look, where you're from, what gender you are, how much you weigh, everything like that. And when teachers ask, it's a joke, we kind of brush it off, but sometimes words do really hurt. And we don't take that into consideration of certain students that may be bullied often. And yes, I think teachers must be more engaging in this kind of conversation in class, because when I'm in class, I do hear students negatively talking about others, but they're, if they're African American, if they're Muslim, or if they're Hispanic, or if they're white, it doesn't matter. So I feel like teachers have a responsibility, as students as well. We also have a responsibility to stand up for each other, and that's something we lack. And that's personally, I try my best to at least stand up for those who are neglected or in any way. And I hope more students will do that too.
I want so much to distill this to one issue like bullying, but I have to resist that temptation. Bullying is one of several things that we suspect and even know more about it contributes not just to school violence, but to self-violence. Assemblymember Barrett referred to. In addition to bullying, there are several other environmental contributions. Now remember, we have genetic responsibility for our behavior, and we have environmental contributions to our behavior. And the exact mix of that and formula for sparking violence or self-destruction is not yet known. But adverse childhood experiences of all types, being witness to direct or indirect physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, experiencing being in a family where separation is caused by incarceration, circumstances where an individual is isolated from others. We've heard this over and over again. These are all factors that contribute to behaviors that are killing us. And to be civil to one another at all ages is critical. Bullying is not new, and it's not restricted to boys. So yeah, we need to look at that. We need to do something about it, and increase our awareness of all of those factors that are adverse to our healthy mental status.
Thank you. There's a late request for a final question from congressional candidate Dave Clay.
HR 38.
Hello? Yep. Good. So I want to follow up on HR 38, which I understand is one of the top priorities of the NRA. And it's my understanding that through the HR 38, Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act will drop down the standards for concealed carry to the lowest common denominator in the country, so that there are 20 states that allow stalkers to retain their guns. There are 12 states that actually do no vetting whatsoever. They don't do background checks, there's no permitting, they allow 18-year-olds to buy the gun, there's no training, and those persons who buy guns from those states will be able to come into New York State and have a concealed carry weapon. So I'm wondering, what benefit does that statute provide to your constituents, and how the law enforcement, Sheriff Barrett and Chief Moore, feel about that statute? Also the fact that it allows, if a police officer is trying to determine whether the person has a permit, and they take those guns away, that they can actually be sued and sought damages against because of that. So anyway, I wanted to find out both Congressman's position on that and the police officers.
It's going to be very hard for our officers locally to determine what the tenets are, the Tennessee pistol permit carry, or in South Carolina or the Arkansas. It's going to be very hard for us to understand the reciprocity process here. Also, it's going to require communications between the states that don't exist right now. So I'm very dubious about how we would be able to, how this is going to be a benefit to us and all law enforcement.
It's going to add more work for us. We are going to have to contact the other states, and it is going to be tough. It's going to be extremely tough for us to figure out what is going on. And so it is going to be tough for the officers on the streets as well as the investigators.
There have been a number of instances where law-abiding citizens from New York going over to New Jersey or Pennsylvania coming into New York have been prosecuted for carrying a firearm, and they are legal in those states. And so if there are jurisdictional questions, which if this proposal were to become law, if there are jurisdictional questions that need to be ironed out, I believe they could be. But again, you take the state of Vermont, which has very few firearms requirements whatsoever. I don't think we are imperiled by the hordes of Vermonters coming over into New York State. Maybe we are for Bernie Sanders, but not from Jimmy Dale. So I would say we're going to disagree on the concealed carry legislation, but you will probably be happy to know that it's unlikely to pass.
Great. Okay, well, I'd like to just wrap up very, very quickly. I'd like to thank our friend Billy for organizing this and making this happen. I'd like to thank the panelists who have put an awful lot of their time into this, and in particular thanks to our friend Didi, because he and his friends are the future of this country. And I think they're going to be in good hands. A couple of just the bottom line themes that I'm just going to put out there. There's a lot of points of disagreement, but there are a lot of points of agreement, and I agree with Congressman Faso when he says that we all have the same broader goals in reducing gun violence in this country, reducing those kinds of situations. We do need to reduce polarization in our society, and I feel like a lot of us are working on that right now. We do need to increase connections among young people and look out for issues. Young males in particular seem to be at all kinds of risk in this country, and we need to address that as a community. We need common sense gun laws, and I think everyone in this room agrees with that. We need to improve background checks, and the final point I'll end with is that we generally agree that teachers in the United States should not be armed. So thank you very much.
Also, I think we can lend Barrett a big hand. He did a terrific job. Very well, Martin, 18 master, and thank you all the volunteers.